Well, good morning, and can I welcome everyone to this, the second meeting of the Public Audit Committee in 2025. The first agenda item is for members of the committee to decide whether or not to take agenda items 3, 4 and 5 in private this morning. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Agenda item 2 is consideration of the Auditor General for Scotland Section 22 report on the 2023-24 audit of Ferguson Marine Port Glasgow Holdings Limited. And before we start, can I remind everyone of my voluntary register of trade union interests? But can I welcome our witnesses this morning? We're very pleased to be joined by Stephen Boyle, the Auditor General, and alongside the Auditor General this morning is Darshi Sansakumaran, who's a Senior Manager at Audit Scotland, and John Boyd, who's Audit Director at Audit Scotland. We've got quite a number of questions to put this morning, Auditor General, but before we get to those, can I invite you to make an opening statement?
Many thanks, Convener. Good morning, Committee. I'm presenting this morning my Section 22 report on the 2023-24 audit of Ferguson Marine Port Glasgow Holdings Limited under Section 22 of the Public Finance and Accountability Scotland Act 2000. The appointed external auditor, John Boyd, has issued an unqualified opinion on Ferguson Marine's financial statements for 2023-24. At the time of the audit, the Scottish Government had not yet confirmed, though, funding for FMPG beyond 24-25, and the auditor highlighted, therefore, a material risk to FMPG as a going concern, as noted by Ferguson Marine Port Glasgow Holding Limited's own management as they set out in the performance report of their annual report and accounts. Since then, Convener, the Scottish Government has confirmed that it intends to continue to provide financial support to FMPG during 2025-26, of course subject to parliamentary confirmation of the budget. Nonetheless, there remain significant risks to the long-term financial sustainability of FMPG. Glen Sannox, of course, as the committee will have seen this week, has entered service. And based on the most recent submission to Parliament, the Glen Rosa is due to be handed over in September 2025. But FMPG has secured limited work beyond the completion of Glen Rosa. It will need to work closely with the Scottish Government to ensure it is able to compete successfully for work and therefore secure its viability. Convener, in my previous report on the 21-22 audit, I raised concerns about governance and oversight arrangements in relation to performance-related bonuses for senior officers. There continue to be weaknesses in FMPG's governance and internal control arrangements. While FMPG recognises this and has made changes following the findings of an internal management investigation into contractor payments, it remains too early to say what impact these changes will have had into the medium term. There have been significant changes in leadership over the past year, and the committee will be aware of the difficulties that the Yard has had in securing a permanent chief executive. This lack of stability in leadership has not helped FMPG stabilise its governance or scrutiny arrangements. My report, for example, refers to the Internal Audit Service not completing its annual programme of work. Convener, John, Darshi and I will do our utmost to answer your questions this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. As I said, we've got quite a large number of questions this morning, so I'm going to start immediately by asking the Deputy Convener to put some questions to you. Jamie.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Good morning, Auditor General and guests. And thank you for your opening statement. Your report paints quite a stark picture of the long-term sustainability or viability of the Yard. You mention in your key messages, points 1 and 2, that there is significant risks and uncertainty around its long-term financial sustainability, a point you've just reiterated. Could you elaborate as to why you've come to that conclusion?
Certainly, and I'll bring in John, I think, as the external auditor, I think, to perhaps frame that for the committee in what that has meant for the audit and John's reporting of that, particularly the point that really is one of the triggers for today's Section 22 report, is the disclosure, firstly and most importantly, that the management of FMPG themselves have made in their annual report and accounts. I mentioned in my opening remarks, Convener, and I think probably best for John to set this out, but I'll touch on it briefly. The accounts aren't qualified. So, because, and the real reason for that is that management themselves have, in the auditor's view, made a very clear disclosure. So they have themselves set out the risks to the financial sustainability of the yard. So that although there are letters of comfort from the Scottish Government, there are funding arrangements in place, both in terms of capital investment and letters of comfort from the Director General for the Economy. The primary reason for the, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, and I'll pass to John to elaborate, is that beyond the completion of Glen Rosa, there is no pipeline of work to support the viability of the yard, Deputy Convener. I'll pause and come back in, but I think perhaps important to hear directly from John and the assessment that he made, first of all.
Thanks and good morning, Convener and members. As the Auditor General outlined, the annual audit report and opinion is unqualified. What we have included within the annual audit report is what's called an emphasis of matter. Essentially, it's the opportunity for the external auditor to draw the reader of the accounts' attention to a matter of significance that's highlighted within the accounts. In the case of Ferguson Marine, it is the going concern and the assumptions around going concern. As part of our audit work, we consider management's assessment of their going concern, and within the annual accounts, the directors have disclosed the key risks and uncertainties associated with the financial sustainability of the yard. As the Auditor General outlined, a key aspect of that is that there's no contracted work beyond the MV Glen Rosa. The business case, the 5-year business plan, outlines opportunities for Ferguson Marine, including the small vessels replacement programme. However, at the time of the signing of the accounts, there's no contracted work in place, and therefore that's where we've highlighted the material uncertainty around going concern, but also then the wider risk around the long-term financial sustainability of the yard.
Okay, so essentially you're making this assertion because the management and the leadership team at the yard have made that assertion. So effectively it's not an external judgment you're making on the yard based on evidence you've been provided. It's actually repetition of what they themselves are saying in their own auditing of the business. And in terms of, you talk about, there's a lot of auditing legalese in there, but you talk about disclosures and emphasis, points of emphasis and so on. What effect does it have on a business when directors of a company make a disclosure such as this? Is there a legal necessity to do so, for example, in the reporting of their accounts? And what effect does it have on the business when they make such an announcement? Because it's quite a profound one to be, for such a big business.
I'll maybe start, actually, John can come in. I think it's not a flow through. I think that's the only thing, just for clarification, that the management of the yard have made this disclosure is very significant, and that has implications. Had they not made that disclosure, it wouldn't be the case that it's automatically the auditor would have said nothing. That would have thrust onto the audit team to make a judgment. Well, based on other sources of information, such as John's assessment of the business plan, sources of funding, he could have come to a different view. So in those circumstances where there's a disagreement between management and the external auditor, it could give rise to a qualification in the accounts, which is something of an escalation of the auditor's view. So that management and the auditor are in agreement, I think, is a positive thing. I think it's an indication of the directors taking their responsibilities very seriously. And to touch on your second point, this is a very serious matter, of course. So directors have responsibilities to make fair, open disclosures, both in terms of Companies Act and also in terms of this being a non-departmental public body, their responsibilities in their appointment as public appointments, as does the accountable officer, which is also set out in the annual report and accounts. So I think, just to agree with you, Deputy Convener, this is a really serious matter, but we think that it has been set out transparently in the annual report and accounts.
Okay, that's helpful. Can we drill into some of the numbers that undermine, that sit behind these assumptions or these conclusions that have been made? And I think there's probably, for the record, a point where I'm saying that no one's comfortable with talking about the yard in this context. However, we're reflecting on what's in the Section 22 report. Therefore, we have to talk about it in that respect. Obviously, when the report was issued, it was your understanding that the year 25-26, there was at the time no financial underpinning from government. However, since then, there obviously has been a draft budget produced, which has allocated a budget line to FMPG. Can you perhaps talk me through what your understanding is of, and let's assume the number that's in the draft budget is the final one. It may change, of course, but for the purposes of today, let's work with what we have in the public domain. Is it your understanding that that is money that's been allocated for the next financial year by government to effectively keep the yard on its feet, to fund operational costs? Is it for staffing costs? Does it include any investment or upgrade allocation? Or is that money, in your understanding as an auditor, is simply to finish the job of the second vessel that the yard is still responsible for completing? Having read the papers, it's a bit unclear as to how we follow that money.
Sure. Well, happy to do our best to provide a bit of clarity. And you're right, and some of it is a timing difference between the publication of a Section 22 report, the completion of the accounts, and so on. So I will pass to John in a moment, perhaps to set out, because there are a number of different funding streams that are here, some of which relate to funding that's set out in the budget. So £47.9 million is the figure that's included in the 25-26 draft Scottish budget. And then there is a further proposed investment, I can call it in those terms, Deputy Convener, of £14.2 million, which is identified to support modernisation activity to help the yard to be better positioned to support its intentions to grow its order book. So those are headline levels, but I think, again, I'm going to pass to John, actually, perhaps to set out what that means for business plan submissions and letters of comfort and so forth, just to really perhaps to address the point that you're asking about certainty and security. I think our assumption is, because of the letter of comfort, because of the figures in the draft budget, the yard had certainty for a further 12 months beyond the date that the accounts were signed. So that is really the requirement that we are required to make following the assessment that the management of the yard has made.
Okay, so, and in your response, Mr. Boyd, one of the things that would be very helpful is we're trying to understand whether the draft budget line of 47.9 includes or excludes any of the additional £14.2 million that was announced separately for investment. That may be a question for ministers rather than yourselves, but presumably you would have looked at that in the whole anyway.
So happy to pick up that the questions that have been raised. So for the year ended 31st of March 2024, the budgetary approval was £76.88 million. There was budgetary approval for the year 24-25 of £62.7 million. That is before the recently announced budget for 25-26 of £47.9 million. When auditing the financial statements for the year ended 31st of March 2024, the date of signing is where we focus and we have the forecast around what the next period of 12 months look like. At that point in time, the 25-26 budget information obviously wasn't available, and therefore we only had what was formally committed was the 62.7 million for the year ended 31st of March 2025. That would really only take the yard up to the March the following year, and we're obviously looking when considering going concern up to the October, and that's where the letter of comfort from the Scottish Government comes in to provide that assurance to the yard around continued support. So actually, as part of the audit work, the £47.9 million was not part of that focus because it was unknown at that time. Yeah. What we have outlined in the annual report is the projected costs and cash flows that the completion of vessels 801 and 802 had at that point in time, and that's what's included within our annual report. In terms of the question about the 25-26 budget information, I wouldn't have the information about whether or not the 14.2 million that was announced of capital support would be included within that. At the time of the audit, that information had been announced, but there had been no formal information reported to Ferguson Marine about what that funding would look like. I would say, however, the business case that I mentioned in terms of the 5-year financial or business plan, it did include what Ferguson Marine would utilise that 14.2 million in terms of investing in the yard and looking to transform it into a commercially viable business.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to that separately, but just before we do so, if we could look at page 8 of your Section 22 report, where you make some assumptions. I guess what I'm trying to get my head around is, for the year 25-26, there'll be a number of variables. There'll be how much money will be required to keep the doors open, if you like, keep the staff there, keep the yard functioning as a going concern for that financial year, and that will come at a cost. There'll be a number associated with that. There presumably will also be a cost to finish the Glen Rosa, and whether that's separate or inclusive of that number, and any additional monies that come towards, for example, capital investment in upgrading infrastructure in the yard, technology, machinery, and so on, to secure future business. And what is not clear to me from the papers is if what is in the draft budget for 25-26 will cover that. And that's really where I'm looking for risk here. And perhaps that's a question you don't know the answer to.
So I think in short, there are variables that probably limit our ability to give you the assurance I think you're looking for today. And the most significant one, of course, is the position of Ferguson Marine Port Glasgow's business plan. And that business plan was predicated on the assumption of the direct award of the small vessels replacement programme. As the committee will be aware, I'm sure that the government, following legal advice, decided to take an alternative route that required FMPG to tender, and that process is currently ongoing. We also know, talk about the various cost streams, 802 being the most significant, the largest project that's ongoing, based on evidence that the yard has given in writing to the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee that it's currently due to submit its updated projection to that committee by the end of this month. So I think that very clearly there are different funding streams, both set out above the £47.9 million to be in the draft budget for 25-26, together with the capital investment, and then the costs assumed for the completion of 802, which straddles 2 financial years really as well. So there's a number of variables still to tease out. But I think, perhaps just to confirm, Deputy Convener, I think it's for the yard or the Scottish Government to be absolutely precise about these numbers rather than us.
Indeed, and those are questions we can ask through due process. You talked a little bit about the business plan and how some of the assumptions that it's made around securing other work. obviously, none of us want to prejudice those decisions in any way, but we do know there is that potential, and that was very much part of the plan, if you like, and of course the investment that's relevant to go towards that. I guess what I'm looking at is, was there any evidence of any other business outside of the small vessel replacement programme? Did in any of the auditing come across any presentations or any disclosures from the business team at the yard about other business that they were seeking? Was it commercially sensitive and they were unable to disclose it? But obviously being a publicly owned and publicly funded business, one would hope there's an element of transparency there. Or is it the case that all the eggs are simply in one basket on the small vessel replacement programme? And if that were not to go ahead, where would that leave the yard?
So I'll start, and I'll bring John in to say a bit more about. I guess in framing it, as you allude to, some of this will be commercially sensitive in the midst of negotiations, and but equally, quite rightly, this is a public body, and especially, I suppose, given the context of the Section 22 report that draws attention to financial viability risks, management own assessment of going concern, it absolutely ought to be discussed. But perhaps hand to John to talk about the business plan, but maybe before doing that, draw committee's attention, and I suppose this came up in evidence, I think, the last time you considered FMPG, about the relationship that the yard has with BAE Systems and the work that it is doing with that organisation. John can clarify in detail, but I think that the yard's own accounts refer to a £1.5 million revenue stream from the engagement with BAE in terms of a 3-unit build for that organisation. So I don't think it is a case that it's solely focused on the small vessel replacement programme. I think there are other sources that are being explored, but again, I'll pass to John to set that in a bit more detail, as much as we're able to.
Thanks. So in terms of additional work, as part of our audit, we obviously have regular engagement with management and the directors, as well as scrutinising what their business plans look like. In terms of the 5-year financial plan itself, it does identify other potential opportunities for the yard. Obviously mindful around some commercial sensitivities around those, but while the small vessels replacement programme really underpinned the 5-year business plan, there were identified working opportunities for specific vessels and pipeline of potential work that the yard has actively been involved in and having discussions with third parties over, in terms of securing additional work outside the small vessels replacement programme. An example, as the Auditor General mentioned, is work with BAE Systems. So that work spanned the last 2 financial years, and demonstrated a commitment to work and deliver work outside of 801, 802, using different skills and expertise that the yard undertakes. Right now, there's no contracted work with BAE, but obviously those relationships have been built up from the delivery of previous activity.
But the 5-year business plan is very much predicated on the award of the small vessel replacement programme. So therefore, it does pose a significant risk in the plan and de facto the long-term future of the yard if that award is not granted to Ferguson Marine. If it goes elsewhere, there's very little outside of that to underpin the sorts of running costs to keep the yard going at the rate it is with the amount of people that are in it. I mean, that's what I'm asking is are the eggs, are not all of the eggs, but most of the eggs in that basket? And does that pose a risk?
Very much so. Very much so. I mean, I think what's clear is that, as things currently stand, subject to events that might unfold over the next few months in terms of future orders, that's not there at the moment. So without that in place, management and an assessment that's been done by the external auditors is that we agree with that. There is doubts about the going concern of the yard unless it's able to generate new orders. That probably feels pretty self-evident.
I'll let others I'll maybe come in later.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to invite Graham Simpson to put some questions to you to, again, develop this theme about the financial sustainability. Graham.
Yeah, thanks very much, Convener. If I can just follow on from that line of questioning about the business plan. So they produced a business plan. So according to you, it assumed the direct award of the contract for the small vessel replacement programme, which was a wrong assumption. You can't assume you're going to get that work. And indeed, it's later transpired. It's late, they're now one of 6 firms in line for that contract. So there's no guarantee they'll get that contract. Does that not fatally hold the business plan that they produced?
So I think it's been a material change of circumstances, absolutely. That, and I guess John might have insight in this about how FMPG arrived initially at that assumption and was then changed. I'm not sure it's a criticism of the yard. I think given that what seems to be either an awareness of or a change in legal advice about the ability of the Scottish Government to make a direct award. This is a complex set of circumstances in terms of effectively state aid arrangements with which government can directly place or otherwise. There's both UK legislation around this as well. But there's no question, and John can elaborate, Mr Simpson, that this was a material change in circumstances. There was one of the direct contributors to the change in management's disclosure about the viability and going concern circumstances in the annual report and accounts.
So, John, before you come in, has there been any attempt to change the business plan in light of the the new development that they have to compete for this work, which I think was entirely predictable that would have been the case. So have they actually gone back and done any revision to this business plan?
So in terms of the actual business plan itself, the assumption around the direct award, while obviously that is it's a fundamental and material change when the decision was taken not to direct award, in terms of some of the underlying assumptions around the timing of contracted work and revenue streams, it was management's view that they wouldn't change materially, whether it was a direct award or a tender process, because the timing of the work would stay essentially the same. So some of those assumptions around when that revenue would be generated would essentially remain the same. What it has done is we've seen in terms of that engagement with, as I mentioned, some other providers which are identified in the business plan to engage in additional work. The business plan itself includes really scenarios around what the future of the yard would look like, and it underpins part of the, as I mentioned, the 14.2 million investment and what that would then be used for to support the yard.
Okay.
Just to come back in for a moment, Mr Simpson, I think the 14.2 million is a very important component of the future. I think the yards themselves have identified to be competitive and viable into the future, they have to modernise. So they have to invest in their facilities to allow them to be able to exactly that, to be a competitive yard, to be credible, their cost base to support that, pace, efficiency, productivity, and so forth. So that investment is absolutely clear and set out in government's intentions. But alongside that, it's as important, but of course, that there's a future order book to support the viability that any modernisation might help.
I mean, I completely agree with that. Mr McMillan and myself have been in meetings where we have argued and others have argued that the yard needs investment to modernise in order to be able to compete for orders and ultimately return to the private sector, which is the government's ambition for the yard. But it needs to modernise. So, I'm in no doubt that is required. But if the yard does not win any of the small vessel replacement programme work, how much does it need to continue? How much work, if it's not that, how much extra work does it need to win in order to be able to continue?
I think that's probably a question for the yard themselves to be better placed to answer. There's no distinction between ourselves and the yard in their drawing attention to the fact that there is doubts about the viability of the yard, and it's not a stretch to say that will cause significant challenges.
Yeah.
If either they're unsuccessful in securing work through the small vessel replacement programme, or that's then not backfilled by other awards or other avenues that they're currently pursuing.
But perhaps let me express it another way. If it doesn't win that work, so let's say they get to September and they finish the Glen Rosa, and the Glen Rosa is off and sailing and carrying passengers, and there is no further work.
Yep.
How long can the yard continue, in your view, without extra work?
I think that depends on engagement that the government will have with the yard. So the government is the primary funder of the yard currently, and that will be a matter for them if they choose, through budget submissions to Parliament, of course, to continue funding the yard. But what there won't be is an alternative revenue stream generating through building ships. So I can't say that there will be, if they're unsuccessful, then that will result in no revenue or the closure of the yard, because that will be a matter for the government as the funder of the yard.
Yeah, but at some point the government's it's going to have to make a decision on what it does about the future of the yard. I just want to ask a couple of other questions at this point. In paragraph 7 of your report, you mention under recoveries funding. Can you tell us what that is? Because it amounts, according to you, to £1 million a month.
Yeah, I'll bring John in actually, because he's got the precise kind of context and detail of that.
So the under recoveries funding is essentially funding that has not been directly attributable to either commercial activity, so essentially recharged to commercial activity for the likes of BAE work, or for the completion of the Glen Sannox or work on Glen Rosa. The majority of the spend would be work around tendering for new business or development of the business case or business planning. For the year ended 31st of March 2024, the level of under recoveries is not material, wasn't material to the financial statements. What we have highlighted in the annual audit report and in the Auditor General's report is the point that those under recoveries are due to increase. The current projections forecast that they could rise to as much as £1 million a month, which touches on the point you were making earlier around what's the long term funding of and funding of the yard. If additional work is not secured, that's what the kind of consequence would be. So where additional work is then won, obviously the level of under recoveries would be reduced.
So these are basically costs that the yard has that they can't charge for, so they're not getting that money back, but it amounts potentially to it's an extraordinary figure, actually, £1 million a month.
Yeah, I think it's just, effectively, as John outlines, this is the future revenue stream that under recoveries will be generating. So, in terms of their commercial activities, operations to secure future work, the detail on that we can share if we have that, what that's made up of. The yard themselves will, of course, give you that detail, but it's probably illustrative of the need for real investment in both modernisation, but also commercial activities to secure that future order book.
Okay. I've just got one more question at this point. Others will be covering other areas. I just want to ask you a question. It's not actually covered in your report, but just wondered if you could bring us up to speed with our efforts, or your efforts, to scrutinise FMEL's accounting records.
Yeah, I'll sit with a word or two and actually bring Darcy in on this point, who's been tracking this from our perspective. The committee will recall this was respect of a forensic accounting investigation into the revenues and costs of Ferguson Marine Engineering Limited, which was the private body that the Scottish Government had provided financial support to before it entered administration, subsequent nationalisation, it became FMPG Holdings Limited. The Scottish Government is leading the forensic accounting review rather than ourselves, because of we don't have the powers, given that this wasn't a public body, to undertake such activity. Tendering had started and is underway. I should probably best bring Darcy in to see where we are in terms of current and then the likely timeline. Last thing I would say, Mr Simpson, before passing to Darcy, is you recall that I've committed to produce my own complementary reporting on this matter at the completion of the forensic accounting analysis to support its consideration by the Public Audit Committee.
Yeah.
Darcy.
Thanks, Auditor General. So the position before Christmas was that the Scottish Government hadn't yet completed the procurement exercise. So I think there had been some issues with, I think, two firms being very close. So they were getting some advice and they were hoping to complete the procurement either before Christmas or early in the new year, but we haven't had confirmation of whether that's been completed yet. I think the Scottish Government are hoping that the analysis will be a kind of two-stage process with a general overview, and then depending on what that throws up, then potentially some more detailed work. I think they're hoping that that will publish in spring, but I think the Scottish Government will be better placed to kind of give you the detail of the timescales, and if they have completed the procurement exercise. But as the Auditor General said, once it is complete, we'll be reviewing the outcome of that analysis, and then the Auditor General will prepare his own review of that.
If a detailed report is necessary, well, I would hope we would get a detailed report. Would you expect to see that in the spring?
I'm not quite sure about the timings of the two stages of the work. I think it will kind of depend on... At the moment, there's a bit of uncertainty about exactly what records there are and how the volume of records, and therefore the amount of work that it will take to actually go through those and what they'll be able to find in them. So I think there needs to be that kind of first stage of assessing, what's there. Is it paper? Are there digital records? What's the kind of scale that they're dealing with before they then can assess what they can do with what's there, essentially.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just before we leave the business plan issue, can I just ask you a couple of quick questions, I think, on the small vessel replacement programme. If I look at the minutes from the board of FMPG, which is attended by the Strategic Commercial Assets Division representatives, there is, on the last published minutes that are available on the website, which is the board meeting of the 30th of May 2024, a clear indication from directors of FMPG that they had legal advice to support the case for a direct award. Do you know anything about the dynamics of that?
I'll bring John in, like, say any kind of further insight, convener, but I suspect there will always be a position where you'll get alternative legal views, depending on the nature of the circumstances. In essence, I'm not sure it terribly matters if FMPG had legal advice. Ultimately, it's the requirement of the Scottish Government to follow its decision-making based on its legal advice, and I think its legal advice led to a change in its position, that they weren't able to make the direct award. I'm fairly sure, and John, if he's able to, can clarify that this will have been influenced by post-Brexit UK legislation would have a bearing on this matter.
Yes, as the Auditor General outlined, the business case itself actually does refer to some of the guidance and advice that the FMPG board obtained, and it actually includes their consideration around the suitability of the direct award. That's obviously seeing the FMPG's side. What I've not been privy to is what the Scottish Government advice has been on the matter, and as the procuring body, the decision really would rest with the Scottish Government.
Yeah. I mean, just for the record, is the procuring body the Scottish Government, or is it CMAL, which the Scottish Government is the sole shareholder in?
Yeah, so my assumption is CMAL, convener, but if I'm incorrect of that, of course, happy to check our records and correct the record.
Yeah, because again, it would be interesting to see whether that legal advice was given to the Scottish Government, to the Cabinet Secretary for Transport, or whether it was given to the board of CMAL, or both, or whatever. Yeah. Sorry, my other question on the small vessel replacement programme is it a single bundle that's gone out to tender and the winner takes all, or could it be that there are different configurations of how that work is awarded?
I'll ask John to come in on that, convener, if we've got the detail, because I recognise it is common to see both alternatives. That it's a package of work, as you say, and is one, or indeed it's in different lots about the provision of contract, and then perhaps I think it will be for the Yard to clarify about subcontracting arrangements that could still be alternatives, and I'm sure that will all be factored into their business planning preparation, even if they're unsuccessful in one or the other. But I'll ask John if we can share any more detail. If not, I'm sure the Yard themselves might be better placed.
Yeah, so within the business plan, the assumption is a single award for a number of vessels. That being said, I think there's an expectation that there will be future awards for the vessel as part of a wider vessel replacement programme, but the current one, as part of the business plan that we're referring to, is a single award.
Okay, thank you. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to move on and ask Colin Beattie to put some questions to you. Colin.
Thank you, Convener. General, I'd like to look at some of the changes that have taken place in senior management and on the board. You've highlighted that there have been these significant changes in 23-24. You also note that there's a review of governance arrangements being completed. It's unusual for the it's usual for the chief executive of an organisation to also be the accountable officer. Can you maybe expand on any concerns that you have on the impact of these changes and how that is ensuring stability in the leadership? Because we now have the accountable officer as a chief financial officer, which is a bit of an odd sidetrack. Maybe you could comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so, Mr. Beattie, and again, I'll excuse me, pass to John if anything he wants to add. So I don't have any concerns per se that it's the Chief Financial Officer who is the accountable officer, recognising, you rightly point out, that it's more typical for the Chief Executive Officer. Excuse me. I think what I would observe is from some of the circumstances of those change is that the interim Chief Executive Officer is focused as part of his role, and he'll be able to speak for himself, I'm quite sure, on the completion of the delivery of primarily vessel 802 or Glen Rosa, and then the future business plan and so forth, that the running and the discharge of accountabilities was deemed engagement with the Scottish Government, that the Chief Financial Officer could undertake those responsibilities. And these are still interim arrangements, I should say, as well. So in the event that they make an assessment, the Government and FMPG, through the Chair of the Board, make an assessment that that has proven to be suboptimal, there is capacity to change. But I think the circumstances that they found themselves in, with the need for some pace around the appointment of an interim Chief Executive following the departure of the permanent Chief Executive in the spring of last year, I don't think it was an unreasonable position to make that designation of accountable officer in the Chief Financial Officer. I think, though, there is a wider point that you're making, that there has been a lot of turnover, a lot of change, both on the board and also in executive level positions. There is a need for stability, a need for clarity around roles and responsibilities. We're happy, I'm sure, to explore further with the committee some of the circumstances that took place around deficiencies in internal control and governance in the organisation during the year. These all need to be addressed and solidified, the improvements that are necessary.
Just continuing on this review of governance, you also state that FMPG should, and I quote, assess whether the existing cohort of board members provides sufficient capacity to support the updated committee structure. Now, when you're talking about whether they have the capacity, are you talking about the skill sets? Are you talking about the sheer numbers of members of the board to support these committees? And how many committees are there and what do they do?
Yes, it's the latter rather than us questioning the skills of the board. I think it's a reference to it's quite a small board. I'll bring John in actually to say about the number and the new committee arrangements. I think it's essentially the risk that with quite a small board, are they being spread quite thinly across the various committee and governance? And not that we're questioning, I think there has been consideration of the need for effective governance, improvements to the workings of committees, but it will be for the government and and through the chair of the board to make an assessment about whether they can discharge all of these responsibilities, governance arrangements effectively under this new setup. But I'll pass to John to elaborate.
Yes, as the Auditor General's outlined there, it's a relatively small organisation, so it's approximately about 320 to 330 full-time staff, and the board reflects that it's a small body. However, there, with the establishment of the Remuneration Committee and Audit and Governance Committee, as well as the board having quite an operational focus, as you would expect, with a key priority being the delivery of the two vessels. There has been a lot of emphasis on and ask on the non-exec members of the board.
Can I just interrupt you there and ask, how many are actually on this board?
I would need to just double check the accounts. I think there's a total of, I think it's 5 members. So there's 2 exec members, being the chief exec and the chief or the director of finance and accountable officer. And then I understand I think it's 4 non-execs, but I just need to double check the accounts.
There are 6 in this listing for the 30th of May last year, so of non-executive directors.
And yeah. And so far you haven't actually described a plethora of committees. It's the sort of committees you'd expect to see in place, the HR committee, the audit committee and so forth. So why is it putting so much pressure on them?
So I think our position touches on not on the skill set, firstly, of the members, Mr. Beattie. So, if you look down the biography of members, you can see that they come from a range of different backgrounds relevant to the delivery and support delivery of the organisation and a non-departmental public body. Capacity-wise, the range of committees, and what you'll find there'll be, members will sit on more than one committee. Their ability to do all of that with this extent of change that has just happened, I think we're challenging and asking of the chair of the board to be satisfied after a period of time that the capacity is sufficient to discharge its responsibilities, bearing in mind there's the significant event of completion of vessel 802 and then all of the commercial requirements to get a new business plan in place. Clearly there is much going on in this organisation, and be satisfied, especially with the governance arrangements and weaknesses that are touched on in this report, that the new model is working appropriately.
It still doesn't seem an excessive amount of committees, unless I'm missing something. 2 committees plus the board shouldn't really be taxing them that much.
We can clarify something John can touch on. So just the requirements upon the non-executives, both in committee and contribution. I hope we're clear this morning that I think we're not questioning that there is insufficient capacity. I think it's going to take a bit of time, probably over the course of the next 6 to 12 months, for the chair to be satisfied that there is sufficient capacity. Clearly, with the volume of change, deficiencies in governance, 4 new members coming onto the board in a short period of time, is that is working effectively. Past history has said that governance hasn't been working effectively within Ferguson Marine Port Glasgow, so he'll want to be satisfied that these changes are making the necessary improvements.
As you yourself said earlier on, it's not a big business. It's not a big company. And looking from the outside in, it doesn't seem that complex. Why is there pressure on so much pressure on the members?
So I think probably, I suppose, the opportunity just to restate, we think there needs to be a period of assessment for this new board. So there are 4 new members, change of committee structure, past history of governance, weaknesses. They'll want to be satisfied that there's adequate capacity, recognising that whilst on the face of it, it might not appear complex in its current setup with a limited order book to complete vessel 802. Moving into the future, that complexity with more certainty around viability will inevitably increase. So I think it's a holding statement, if I can put it in those terms, Mr. Beattie, that the board, the chair, Scottish Government as the shareholder will want to be satisfied that capacity is appropriate and governance improves.
The construction of the vessels are an operational issue. You take the HR committee. The HR committee isn't really involved in the building of these vessels. They have their own structure and what they're doing. And I think we can all get our hands around what that would be. The audit committee isn't operationally committed either. It's dealing with the internal circumstances of the company, just like in any other business. I'm struggling to see the additional operational pressure on HR committee and an audit committee of the construction of these vessels.
Well, perhaps not directly related to the vessel, but still fundamental to the effective running of the organisation. I would argue, and I think today's report and similarly the previous Section 22 report from firstly touch on the role of the HR committee, have seen that governance as it related to previously the award of performance-related bonuses, and in today's report touching on the completion of settlement agreements without the visibility of effective governance to the HR committee are areas to be addressed. So whether that means more input, better papers, more clarity around roles and responsibilities for the HR committee, one factor. For the audit and risk committee, we're setting out that there were deficiencies in internal control within the yard during 23-24. An internal audit programme that wasn't completed. When you look at the some of the risks that the internal auditors are highlighting over the course of the year. 10 high-risk recommendations, 19 medium-risk recommendations. There is undoubted work for a Board of Governance and its committees to get a handle on these issues. So hopefully I'm not disagreeing with Mr Beattie about, on the face of it, that it's clear what this organisation is there to do, but governance hasn't been good enough. So that's going to require either clarity of roles and responsibilities or more capacity. And our report today in John's annual audit report is clear that that needs a period of close review.
But you are satisfied as to the competencies of the board?
So,
board members.
So we're seeing there's been a change of board members, and and that has brought what looks to be appropriate skill set. That judgment though is for the chair of the board and Scottish ministers through the public appointment process to be satisfied about the skills and competencies of non-executive appointments.
Okay, I'll leave that for the moment. You mentioned a few minutes ago about settlement agreements and the HR committee handling settlement agreements, something that this committee has been interested in the past. Can I just ask if you're aware whether a financial package or settlement agreement was offered to the former chief executive when his contract was terminated?
We can share some detail on that. I think some of it, as we set out in the report, there was a settlement agreement for the former chief executive. That was if I step back for a second, there were 3 settlement agreements during the year. 2 for members of management who weren't senior managers, but only of those 3, only 1 received Scottish Government approval, and that was for the former chief executive, which is in respect of payment in lieu of notice for the former chief executive.
So that was approved by the Scottish Government?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, okay. I'll just move on to something about risk management. We've been talking about risk management and governance arrangements, and obviously the one thing that really stands out is where you state that significant delays to the commencement and completion of reviews that were agreed within the 23-24 audit plan. Now, in paragraph 19, page 9, you say that internal audit was unable to complete enough reviews to provide an opinion on the overall risk management, control and governance arrangements. Now, that's pretty sweeping. Maybe I could get a bit more information on that because to get a better understanding of where the issues arose on this. Again, coming back, is it a capacity issue within FMPG, or is it an issue with the auditors? Is it a combination of both? How did that come about?
Yeah, I'll bring John in a moment to set out, I suppose, some of that kind of latter point that just to explore about why weren't they able to complete the review. I would offer a view, just first of all, Mr Beattie. This is significant that the internal audit function is a fundamental plank of the assurance and internal control arrangements of any organisation, especially one spending public money. It's a requirement of the Scottish Public Finance Manual that public bodies have an internal audit service. So I would say, going back a few years and the creation of Ferguson Marine Port Glasgow as a public body brought internal audit into its arrangements. I think we're right in saying that they hadn't previously had internal audit service as a private company. Nonetheless, that this firm of auditors set out a programme of work for the year. An annual plan was considered by the Audit and Risk Committee, but that they weren't able to complete it is significant. It means that the Audit Committee and then also the accountable officer doesn't have all the information at their disposal to make a rounded assessment of the adequacy of controls, how well public money is being spent. And I think, as I'd mentioned a moment or two ago, for the reviews that they were able to complete, that they're identifying 10 high-risk areas is a matter of significance. 19 further medium-risk recommendations to be implemented. So reviews weren't completed, not able to complete the whole plan. So there's a gap in the control environment. And I'm sure that, that as the external auditor is concerned, I'm concerned about that, and I'm sure, to speak on the committee's behalf, as the Public Audit Committee, we're equally concerned to bring it to your attention today. The reasons behind it, some of it will be capacity, I'm sure, rather than a deliberate attempt to thwart the work of the internal auditor. But again, I'll pass to John to develop that further.
Thanks. So in terms of the internal audit's ability to complete the work, the internal audit were appointed in May 2023. The committee may be aware this was an area that was highlighted previously about the lack of an internal audit function and the importance of having an internal function, as the Auditor General has outlined, in terms of that framework of internal governance and control. The reason for the delays, the internal audit themselves actually outlined within their annual audit report. Key challenges where essentially it's the first year, it's the first time that this organisation has an internal audit function. So actually getting up to speed with internal audit reviews, the presence of an internal audit review. But one of the key challenges was actually just a change in senior management within the organisation. So as we outlined, there was a change in key officers, including the chief executive officer and the chief finance officer, two senior positions within the organisation that would essentially act as sponsors for internal audit, and that was one of the reasons for some of the delays in the ability to complete the whole audit programme for the year, and ultimately, as the Auditor General outlined, providing an overall opinion on the internal control and risk environment.
So you're saying that you couldn't do sufficient reviews to give a proper audit opinion. Can you boil that down to a percentage? I mean, did you get half the reviews done, quarter of the reviews done, or is it just across the board reviews weren't really completed?
So there were three reviews that were completed and reported, covering IT, risk and payroll. Each of those reviews, the internal auditor concluded limited scope. This was in the conclusion, and it's really at the internal auditor's opinion as to whether or not they've undertaken sufficient work to provide an independent opinion and assurance to the board, and they have concluded that they haven't undertaken sufficient work within the organisation to enable them to issue that opinion. That would really be a matter for internal audit's professional judgment.
The Auditor General says in his report that it is important that FMPG management engages with internal audit. The implication is, of course, that they're not engaging with internal audit. Is that correct?
So I don't think it's an either or. I think what we're finding is that they have engaged with internal audit for the reviews that they've undertaken. But I think, as I mentioned at paragraph 18 of the report, and John's just referred to, internal audit also note that as the changes in senior management, the loss of key management personnel, together with the focus on the delivery of the vessels, has meant that they haven't had the time or access to complete the entirety of their programme. What I would expect during the current financial year is that, because it's a rolling programme, Mr. Beattie, so the planned reviews for the 25-26 review would remain or prioritised, but the ones that weren't completed would also be done in the current financial year. So there's access issues, there's capacity issues, focus on the delivery of the vessels, all of which have restricted internal audit's ability to deliver. This is an agreed programme. This programme would have been agreed with the Audit and Risk Committee to support the delivery of assurance for FMPG. So we expect to see progress and catch up this year.
So it was signed off by internal audit, or at least by the Audit Committee?
So the Audit and Risk Committee, how internal audit would work, they'll share their plan. There'll be a rolling 3, sometimes 5-year plan that they'll share with the Audit and Risk Committee. the year in question, they'll give detail. The scope for reviews will be shared with the committee, the audit committee.
Just one final question to you on this. I can understand that an organisation that within its existing culture had never had an internal audit function, the difficulties of adjusting to that and taking part in that. I can understand that. Are you satisfied that sufficient progress is being made that the 25-26 internal audit function will deliver what's required?
I'll ask John to pick that up if we've got kind of insight.
So the latest update, the financial year or the audit year, if you like, actually spans the year end. So often internal audit functions will be reporting right up to June, really to align with the financial statements preparation process and providing assurance for the publication of the accounts. There were a number of ongoing internal audit reviews that were live at the latest update we had, so it's difficult to form a conclusion as to, or to form an opinion as to whether or not they'll complete the work this year. However, there has been clear commitment from Ferguson Marine and the Audit Committee around the importance of the role of internal audit and a commitment to complete complete the work in sufficient time to provide an independent opinion for 24-25.
But is there an indication of sufficient progress being made and sufficient commitment to ensure that reviews going forward will be completed?
I would say at the latest, it's quite early in their year to actually form a judgment as to whether or not they will complete that review. However, I don't have any concerns based on the latest update that they aren't committed to getting the internal audit programme complete.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Graham Simpson's got a very specific question on this area that he wants to put to you before I invite Stuart McMillan to put some questions to you.
Thanks.
Graham.
Thanks, Convener. You mentioned the internal audit picked up 10 high-risk areas. Can you say what they were? Can you at least tell us some of them?
So if we've got that detail, we'll share, but just for completeness, those spanned internal audit reviews on risk management, payroll and IT controls. I'm not trying to link necessarily issues, but we've covered this morning already, but we do touch in today's Section 22 report about deficiencies in some of the HR governance in terms of settlement agreements. So I think it perhaps as an example, Mr Simpson, that internal audit needs to be taken very seriously by any organisation, but especially one that is reporting 10 high-risk recommendations.
Okay.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm now going to invite Stuart McMillan to put some questions to you. Stuart.
Okay, thank you very much, Convener. So just a couple of very brief questions on some earlier issues, just to get a bit of clarity. In your main report, published in October, on paragraph 25 and page 15, you touch upon the loss on the BAE contracts. Now, bearing in mind with the earlier questions from Jamie Green regarding the future and the business plan for the yard, I would assume that BAE contracts, or further contracts, are included in that. Can you tell the committee what the financial loss was on the BAE contracts of the past?
Yeah, I'll bring John. Can I ask Mr McMillan, could you repeat the paragraph? I think
sure, it's paragraph 25, page 15
this
of the main report.
This is of the
October.
annual audit report.
Yes.
From, yeah, thank you.
It's the top, the bullet point at the top of page 15.
Yes, thank you. I'll bring John in actually just to set out a bit of detail. I think I'd referenced earlier on in the discussion, drawing on Ferguson Marine Port Glasgow's annual report and accounts, where they set out £1.5 million revenue from the 3-unit build with BAE Systems. Clearly, revenue is just one side of the balance sheet, the transaction for that in terms of its financial contribution in the round. John can maybe set out a bit of detail that kind of perhaps puts that a bit more widely.
Yeah, so the paragraph being referred to was essentially explaining what the capital contribution funding was, essentially where there was a requirement for funding from Scottish Government, and we've included a number of different aspects within that. Within the FMPG Commercial, which was one of the subsidiary companies where the BA activity is going through, the total loss or reported loss for the year was £300,000. That will include, as we touched on earlier, aspects of tendering for future work and planning for future work, not necessarily just purely because of the loss of the BE contract itself, or the end of the BE contract.
I don't think that actually answers the question. So I'm just looking for the specific figure with regards to the financial loss that the yard had to deal with because of the BE contract, the work that they undertook for BE. You can come back.
We may need to do so just to come back to you with the detail on that. We'll have a look at our papers just now, but if we don't have that for the end of the session, we can come back to this in writing.
And the second very brief question is just regarding the questions from Colin Beattie regarding board meetings and that governance. The board only meets 6 times a year. Now, bearing in mind the challenges that have been well documented from yourselves and also others, 6 times a year, is that enough for a board to really get on top of all the challenges and risks that are faced?
I guess there's 2 factors I would point to. It is for the chair of the board and the board to determine the frequency that the board needs to meet to discharge its responsibilities. I think the other relevant factor to it is that governance is not just discharged through the board. I think that probably speaks to the growth in the committee structure. That was a feature of the governance review. It's also a reasonable position to take, that it can get into some of the specifics of effective governance that's required for the delivery, whether it's audit and risk or HR matters or particularly health and safety in this context. It's absolutely a topic that should be kept under close review. So it's not one that should just fall into a rhythm that is or isn't satisfactory. The chair should be satisfied and test regularly, Mr McMillan, as to whether that's the right frequency. But I think it's their judgment at the moment. Okay,
I mean, I'm sure I'll have the opportunity to take that on further in the future. So certainly thank you for those areas. I want to kind of touch upon the aspect regarding the public sector pay policy and also the exit packages. Obviously, I think Colin Beattie asked the questions regarding the exit package for the previous chief executive, and as the Section 22 report touches upon, there were a couple of payoffs that didn't go through the correct procedures. So the report outlines that also the FMPG is not required to comply with public sector pay conditions, but there is an expectation that FMPG will align with the principles of public sector pay policy. Can you provide further detail on the implications if FMPG does not ensure compliance with the framework agreement and relevant sections of the SPFM?
Yes, happy to start on that. So I think you're right. Paragraph 24 of the report, we say they are not bound by the requirements of public sector pay, but to align with those. Something of a generic, slightly vague reference. But I think what it does is affords FMPG flexibility. This committee and other committees have heard about some of the challenges, the need to secure sometimes high-cost specialist skills and leadership positions in the yard. That is reflected ultimately in the framework agreement that you mentioned, that gives the yard that flexibility. So the implications for not complying, I guess ultimately they don't have to comply with public sector pay policy are the circumstances that are set out. So probably it can be a bit of a moot point then about what happens if you don't reference public sector pay. The point I think we set out in the report, I think probably the more serious one, is that settlement agreements were entered into without the necessary approval as is required by the Scottish Public Finance Manual. It'll ultimately be a matter for the Scottish Government as shareholder to take a view on that, about what the significance of it. What they didn't do, again, in the committee we're familiar with this from its consideration of other public bodies and settlement agreements. Again, we have an example of the Scottish Government not giving either prospective or retrospective approval. I think that's an indication, if I can put it in such terms, of the dim view that the Scottish Government has taken about the process that was followed in the award of settlement agreements. That governance wasn't appropriately followed. And as we set out lastly at paragraph 28, Mr McMillan, not having appropriate documentation either. So these are all indications of poor processes, poor governance, decisions not being taken properly. Of course, it will be for the Scottish Government themselves to express a view about what they made of that.
Thank you for that. Can I just confirm that in terms of Ferguson's themselves, did they seek approval from the Scottish Government, or did that not happen?
So John can clarify, but I think as we set out, that the Scottish Government didn't provide retrospective approval is indication that such approval was sought.
Okay. So just with that, also the threshold is £95,000. And as you've said a couple of times already today, that there has been significant turnover of the senior staff, and it's in the report as well, of course. Now, as you're aware, also, I'm the constituency MSP. I grew up in Port Glasgow. I still live in Inverclyde. I know a lot of folk who work in the yard, and I hear a lot of different things coming from various people in the yard. And there's a consistent thing that I have heard over quite some time, and that is a revolving door of people coming and going. So that chimes with what you've already said today. Sure. Now, I've heard different examples of people coming in. They're in maybe for 2 or 3 months, and they're away, and then they leave with a package. Now, I would assume that those packages are under the £95,000. Yep. And I can assure you, it is of great frustration to the workforce who have been there for many years, to see people coming and going and leaving with a fairly hefty settlement because their time in the yard hasn't worked. Do you have any indication as to, and have you seen any information with regards to how many people under that threshold have came and went, and also what the level of the total level of quantum has been on an annual basis in terms of those settlements?
Yeah, I can start, and I'll pass to John in a moment to give a bit more detail, but I think the circumstances you're outlining are largely reflected in the disclosures that the Yard has made in its annual accounts. So, for example, disclose that there's a turnover rate of 22% within the Yard. There were 21 exit packages in total during the financial year at a cost of £440,000. So this is perhaps illustrative of a significant volume of change of personnel. It maybe even speaks to the point we've discussed already this morning about access to the right people, change of senior leadership for internal audit and other factors. What I don't have, Mr McMillan, is, given this is the only nationalised shipyard that we audit, as to whether that's a comparable industry standard that we would expect. But I think it gives a sufficient indication of there's a volume of change happening within the Yard. The underlying reasons for that will be varied, but it probably supports the insight that you've gained from your local presence. But I'll bring John in if there's anything further he wants to add.
Yeah, just really to add to the Auditor General's comment there, in terms of the 21 individuals, I understand I think it was 10 of those individuals, the exit in the year was due to ill health. Given the nature of the industry, there are regular health assessments and minimum health criteria, as you would expect within the organisation, and therefore there's a degree of turnover in the year as part of that. To compare, I think what we would do as auditors is a year-on-year comparison. In the prior year, the number was 7, so it's significantly lower. So 23-24 was quite a high level of exit packages in a particular year that we've not observed from Fergus Marine in the past.
Okay. Can I just ask? I probably know the answer to this, but have you, when you are undertaking the audit work, you'll clearly be in the office. You'll be looking at the facts and figures and information that's presented. Do you ever go and talk to the folk on the shop floor just to gain any knowledge and understanding from them as well?
So as part of our audit on-site visit, we actually undertook a tour of the vessel under development. It was in the yard at the time, and as part of that, the audit team had interaction. Generally, our focus is predominantly with finance team and finance personnel, payroll personnel, and then obviously as part of that, those involved in governance.
No, I was just going to add, actually, you'll see, I guess, from the annual report and accounts that the various parts that John and his team and what the audit covers, but specifically required to look at detail at the staff disclosures. So, the exit packages, the remuneration that's paid to senior officers, governance arrangements. But in totality, auditors are required to understand the business. So our work is framed by auditing standards, and that's one of the central elements of it. We can't be confident in giving an opinion. Back to the Deputy Convener's first point, it's not just a straight flow through. We have to independently make an assessment, a judgment upon the organisation so that we can meet the requirements which we're held to.
No, that's helpful. Just on the come back to the Scottish Public Finance Manual and also the 95k threshold, and also the internal mechanisms within the yard. So, with regards to the 21 individuals, were they all? Would they have been signed off by the board, or would it just been an operational matter?
So as one of the aspects we've reported in the annual audit report, there wasn't visibility through the remuneration committee around the sign-off of those.
And John's right, that's what really, I think, the quite stark judgment that we make, paragraph 28, that there was an absence of compliance with the Scottish Public Finance Manual. There wasn't appropriate documentation held, and there wasn't the visibility that you would expect of proper governance channels, whether more typically, I would think, through the HR Remuneration Committee, but certainly for senior officers, and especially where those exit packages and resultant settlement agreements are in excess of the £95,000 threshold, that those weren't visible in governance terms is a significant weakness.
And just finally, with regards to the two that happened, that also the Scottish Government didn't provide the guarantee for, you'll clearly know what the quantum was for those. Are you able to share that with the committee in terms of what each of the packages totalled?
I'll ask John to cover that if we have that detail.
Yes, so one of the packages was £96,000, so just slightly above the threshold, and the other one was, I think, 106,000.
Okay. Okay. I won't proceed further because. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Can I just pick up on a couple of points related to the questions that Stuart McMillan was putting to you? I mean, first of all, back on the 1st of June 2023, Mr Miller, the chair of the board of FMPG, had an exchange with the committee where we were asking him about these performance bonuses that seemed to prevail at the time amongst the senior management team particularly, and he said they are not performance bonuses, they are retention payments. Now, I suppose there are two sides, there are two ways of looking at that question. Is it the case that there is no longer a retention payment regime and therefore people are all leaving the business on block? Or does there still exist some kind of performance bonus system that applies to members of the senior management team at FMPG?
I'll ask John to come in and set out what the disclosures are in the Remuneration Committee, the Remuneration Report and the Annual Report and Accounts Convener. But yes, I do recall the exchange that took place between the committee and the former chair. John.
So during the year, and we've actually followed up the recommendation as part of our annual audit report. It's included within the appendices as part of a review following the audit findings and the Section 22 report. There was a review done of the incentives package for senior personnel, and there's no longer a bonus payment or retention payment within the yard.
Auditor General.
Just for completeness, Convener, actually, I think that's reflected in the Remuneration and Staff Report on page 13 of Ferguson Marine's accounts. So the last retention payment was made to the former Chief Executive in the 22-23 financial year. There are no disclosures of retention payments in this year's accounts.
Okay, thanks for clearing that up. Can I also go back to these cases of settlement agreements? And you said there had been 3 above the threshold and 2 hadn't been approved. And the Scottish Government clearly were taking a dim view of that and hadn't indeed applied retrospective approval. But can I take you to the case that they did approve? Because in your Section 22 report in paragraph 14, you say the former Chief Executive's employment was terminated citing unsatisfactory performance. When we look at the Scottish Public Finance Manual, paragraph 27, it says quite clearly settlement agreements should not be used to deal with poor performance. So why would the Scottish Government approve that?
So you're right, both those things are the case. Just for clarity, the board cited, rather than us citing poor performance for the former Chief Executive. But it is the case that this was a decision taken by the board. They engaged with the Scottish Government. They received approval for that. What we haven't seen is the circumstances or the detail of what was put to the Scottish Government requesting a settlement, but those do appear to be contradictory statements. What we're drawing, I think, attention in comparison, in addition to that, Convener, is process was followed in respect of the termination of the former Chief Executive, in contrast to the 2 other settlement agreements that were entered into.
Yeah, I accept that process was followed, but the Scottish Public Finance Manual has a certain status, doesn't it? And if it sets out, and indeed it's probably a reflection on previous inquiries this committee has conducted itself into situations where people have performed badly and, to use the colloquialism, have been rewarded for bad behaviour and have walked out of public sector organisations with a large amount of public money by way of a settlement agreement, when in most objective observers' eyes, they shouldn't have received some kind of reward. They should have left with no extra payments other than those that they were contractually due.
And I think those are the circumstances that we have here. I think these are contractual payments in lieu of notice rather than additional payments to facilitate someone's exit. That's our understanding, Convener, is that the payment reflects payment in lieu of notice.
Okay. Okay. And do we know whether there was a non-disclosure agreement attached to it?
I think the Yard would need to confirm, but I think what we can say is non-disclosure agreements have been a feature within the range of exit packages that, and I think what the Yard's understanding, and John can confirm, is that because of the competitive commercial nature of some of these activities, that has resulted in their use of non-disclosure agreements. However, of course, the committee will be familiar that these should only be used where appropriate and sparingly, rather than a presumption that those will be included in any departure arrangements.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that stands out from this report is the case of somebody who was brought in on a secondment basis from CMAL. And according to your description of it, they were originally engaged on a contract on secondment with a salary of £36,000 a year. That was then uplifted to a salary of £54,000 a year. And then an arrangement was entered into where money was paid, instead of through a salary payment, money was paid into a limited company where this employee was the sole director. I mean, that's quite extraordinary, isn't it?
Very unusual circumstances, Convener, no doubt. So these, I think, is illustrative for all the reasons that you set out and quote from the report, of a breakdown of controls and process within FMPG, insufficient approvals, governance to support this decision. What we would offer, I suppose, in mitigation is that the awareness of this came about through the work of the accountable officer. So he initiated a review into contractual payments that the Yard was making upon taking on that designation, and this came about and highlighted how deficient that this arrangement was. And the one point I would add, just to the numbers that you've quoted, Convener, is that when a person who's operating through their own company, HMRC require the paying body to be satisfied about what off-payroll arrangements, whether this is a proxy for payroll and the resultant tax arrangements. So what that then led to FMPG having to make a further payment for PAYE and national insurance that hadn't been made, of £48,000 to HMRC. Perhaps again, just to point that the proactive nature of FMPG's work, they engaged with HMRC quickly on it, they made the necessary disclosures and thus avoided any penalties for it. But it reflects, Convener, a poor set of circumstances, poor controls and poor governance that allowed such arrangements to take place.
Yeah, and again, just to recap on the figures involved. So the person originally engaged on 36,000, the salary rises to 54,000. But what you document here is that in the period from February 2023 to March 2024, FMPG were invoiced by this individual's company for £144,000. I mean, that's quite a leap in payment as well, isn't it?
Yeah, something of an exponential growth in payments between 36 to 54 to 144. John can give a bit more detail on what we've seen. I think satisfied that there was an increased volume of time commitments and expectation that the secondee from initially secondee from CMAL was providing to FMPG, but it's absolutely stark, the growth and a concern, Convener, that those circumstances were allowed to materialise without proper checks, balances, controls. Again, I will pass to John, but I think it's something the Yard themselves want to be clear that they have the circumstances in place to avoid any repeat. And we've seen that, improved controls or plan for improved controls, segregation of duties and necessary approvals so that that can't happen again. But I'll pass again to John just to kind of set out some of the detail behind what took place.
Thanks, Auditor General. So it's firstly worth just quantifying that the £36,000 was the salary, so it excluded national insurance and tax contributions. So when the day rate was set under the contract, that factors in those additional costs that would be the responsibility of the employing body to cover as part of that. Another contributing factor to the significant increase in the total cost, as the Auditor General alluded to, was the increased volume of days covered. At the stage of completion, the individual involved was actually entitled to significant annual leave from their employing body, CMAL, and there was an agreement reached that the individual would work essentially work those days at FMPG and at the increased day rate. So the actual volume of activity they were involved in and the number of days recharged increased significantly.
So if this individual is seconded from CMAL, then presumably CMAL are party to these agreements?
So I think an interesting... Convener, you may have seen the evidence that the Chief Executive of CMAL gave to the Net Zero Economy and Transport Committee last week.
Mr Hobbs.
Mr Hobbs, indeed, where I think CMAL were party to the initial secondment, but I'm clear, and certainly through John's audit work, that CMAL weren't cited in the totality of the arrangements. And as Mr Hobbs described it, these were an odd set of circumstances. So I'm not clear that they were aware of particularly the move from secondment to their own private company.
And just to go back, Mr Boyd, on what you had said, and to be clear about it, you said that well, the arrangement, the original 36,000 was the kind of net salary figure and so on, and that when we're looking at these other figures, but the 144,000 payment didn't include the outstanding HMRC. Sorry, the 144,000 invoice presumably didn't take account of the fact that there was going to be a tax liability of £48,000.
So you're right, that's in addition to it. So the tax liability... So really, when FMPG engaged with the company payment arrangements, FMPG's position at that time, since rectified, is that payroll tax arrangements are a matter for that company as a supplier. However, what they failed to take account was what's known as IR35 regulations, is that when it looks like an off-payroll arrangement, the paying company has to make a more rounded assessment of whether this is actually akin to somebody who should be on your payroll and therefore paying tax. So yes, for absolute clarity, Convener, this would be 144,000 plus the underpayment of tax of 48,000.
Okay, thanks. And I just want to finish up with a couple of points, because when I look at there's a framework agreement in place, isn't there, between the Scottish Government and FMPG to try to clear some of these things up and make sure we've got good governance arrangements. One of them is one part of the framework agreement is headed up staff management, and bullet point number 1 is the recruitment of its staff, i.e. FMPG, must be based on fair and open competition and equal opportunities. Well, the case we've just been discussing is unlikely to pass that test, is it?
I'll perhaps not express a direct judgment on it, because my understanding is that these were specialist skills that FMPG required to access. So I don't know if that would allow them some flexibility or mitigation, Convener, but I don't think it detracts from the overall principle as set out in the framework agreement, of course, that any public body would be bound by. You must follow proper recruitment, selection, employment practices. Okay, thank you. These may be questions we will be posing to the Scottish Government and the FMPG representatives. But also in that framework agreement,
and this goes to the point that you've been addressing for much of this morning, which is about governance arrangements. Portfolio accountable officer responsibilities. The portfolio accountable officer in the Scottish Government is the DG Economy. And it says in that framework agreement that the company must conform to the requirements both of propriety and of good financial management. Do you have any reflections on whether those criteria have been met, and to what degree is there an element of responsibility here for the accountable officer in the Scottish Government?
So I think there's enough examples in today's Section 22 report and in the annual audit report that there were deficiencies in governance and in internal control, both in the management of the settlement agreements especially. And those will have to have been reflected upon by the portfolio accountable officer, as you rightly say, the Director of General Economy, in his submission to the Principal Accountable Officer of the Scottish Government, the Permanent Secretary, for the completion of... so you're right, it is probably a matter for the Director of General Economy to express his view on these circumstances, but I think we're relatively clear, Convener, that there's enough evidence in the reports that there were deficiencies in these areas that ought to warrant the clear attention of the Director General for the Economy.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Graham Simpson and Stuart McMillan for a final couple of short questions which they have got. Graham.
Thank you very much, Convener, and it actually just follows on from some of your earlier questions. You know, when I've been reading your report and hearing the evidence today, it feels like, you know, when we hear about big payments being made without permission, it's got a bit of a Wix feel about it to me. And you know the work we've been doing on that. You know, money being spent without approval. Can I ask? The convener was asking about the case of the secondee who ultimately set up a limited company, and this was discovered by the accountable officer. Was it discovered before the previous chief executive was sacked?
John can give a bit of insight into the timeline of those events, but you're right. This was discovered upon review by the new accountable officer. So I'm not quite sure how those timelines overlap or marry up. I suspect the Yard will be able to give the committee that level of detail about which events took place. But I'll pass to John if we've got any just that clarity you're looking for.
Yes, so the review was actually initiated. It was initially it was a review of underlying sort of contracts. So as at that time the Director of Finance, he was relatively new to the organisation. He was looking to understand where the organisation is spending its money, what its contractual commitments were. As part of that review, they identified the contract with the secondee and undertook an investigation. That work was undertaken between March and April 2024, with the final report concluding in the April 2024, with the accountable officer, the new accountable officer then concluding on what the findings from that investigation were.
So just to save me looking it up, because I can't remember when David Tideman was fired. Was that before or after?
It was during the March. It was during the March that David Tideman left the organisation, and the review was undertaken during March. I couldn't give an exact date of when it was initiated as such, but the formal report wasn't concluded until April.
Okay, and was it Mr. Tideman who approved this arrangement?
Yes, that's
yes.
Understanding.
Yes, and was it also Mr. Tideman who approved the other payments which were above the 95,000 threshold that the Scottish Government hasn't given approval for?
So one of the payments was the former accountable officer, and the other payment was the former interim director of finance.
So it wasn't Mr. Tymon?
It wasn't Mr. Tymon, no.
So those two were approved by different people?
One was Mr. Tymon, one was the former.
Oh, so one was Mr. Tymon?
Yeah.
Right. And one was somebody else?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you think there's any connection between Mr. Tymon being asked to leave the organisation and these discoveries?
I think it's probably rather not speculate on without absolute clarity on the timeline, and I think it would be for the board to provide that to the committee, Mr. Simpson, about any further detail they can share about the circumstances that allowed them to quite publicly state their dissatisfaction with Mr. Tymon's performance that led them to the conclusion of his departure from the organisation. So I think that's probably the basis of which we've arrived at our position on it.
Yeah, I mean, there are obvious questions to ask, but we're still not clear, and I guess we can ask them if they come in what this poor performance actually was. But you don't know.
So again, we understand that the board was the detail I think is for the board, but I think that particular notice about their consideration of business plan, future projections, viabilities were factors. But I think beyond that, that is our understanding is something that for the board to get into.
Okay, thank you, convener.
Thank you very much. Stuart McMillan for a final question.
Yeah, thank you. So just it's regarding the contractors. It's not so much about individuals, but in terms of the subcontractor organisations. So with the Chief Financial Officer review that we've just spoken about, did that also include those subcontracts for like so the various suppliers that come in to do work?
Yeah, so the review was looking, essentially it was looking to understand where the contracts and what spend the organisation is undertaking. Ferguson Marine, the majority of contracts that has in place are with large-scale suppliers, as you can imagine within that organisation. And this was one contract that was unusual, and then from further investigation, they identified the underlying scenario and then took action to address it.
Okay. Are you content with the work that has been undertaken in that regard, particularly with regards to the larger contract organisations?
So, as part of our audit, as you can imagine, we've reviewed the work that's been undertaken by the accountable officer, and looked to make sure there was no other such circumstances and potential risks, so comfortable with the completeness of the work undertaken.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And can I thank our witnesses this morning for the evidence that you have given us. Auditor General Stephen Boyle, John Boyd and Darshi Sansa-Kumaran, thank you very much indeed for your evidence. Before we move into private session, I'll just remind people this is our final Thursday morning meeting. We will switch to a Wednesday morning meeting from next week onwards. But I now will move the meeting into private session.